Hello, everybody. What's going on? Peace and power and elevation be to all you magnificent, beautiful people out there across the world. This your girl Tiffany French coming through here live in effect. And today's subject, I want to put my focus on Black journalism. Now, journalism is very important because in journalism, you keep up with the news that's going on in your environment, your community, right? And also you get stories that may not be pertaining within your environment, but also that happens in the world. Okay, so it's very important. So peace to the chat. Shout out to Brother Umi. It's very important that you know about journalism, right? And that's one of the key things that we have to have in our community is journalism. So you got various type of journalism. You got sports, you got news, you got hip hop, you got um fashion, you got all these different things. All these different type of journalism. But journalism is very important. Now, here's the downside to it. Is the information accurate? Because some information can be based on propaganda because they're just trying to sell, they're trying to market and trying to gain viewership, profits, or whatnot. And then some of it is legitimized. However, not all journalism make it to the mainstream. So you have to go to other sources where you have to find websites. You may have to find it on YouTube. You know, things like that. Shout out to Brother Centavo. Peace to Centavo. All right, so the first person I'm going to talk about in journalism is Louis Austin. So Louis Austin was a journalist during his time, and also a social activist. Okay, so he did a lot for North Carolina in Durham, North Carolina area. So that's the areas that he mostly covered. And so yes, he happened to be one of the unsung heroes or the unsung journalists of our time. So a lot of the people that I'm going to cover, they are unsung. They have not received a lot of recognition, or a lot of people don't know who they are. Okay. So it's a long list. It's a very long list. All right. So the first person I chose to cover is Louis Austin. And we're going to get into that information. Make sure you subscribe to the channel, like the channel, share the channel, all that great stuff. Hit the notification bell and let everybody know what's going on. You know what I'm saying? And thanks to everybody that's been subscribing. Shout out to my new subscribers. I really appreciate that a lot. That really means a lot to me. So now let's go ahead and get started. All right. So, of course, we're going to go to your source right here, Wikipedia. So what does Wikipedia say about Louis Austin? So Louis Austin was an African-American journalist, a civic leader, a activist, and he purchased the Carolina Times in 1927 and transformed it into an institution that aided African Americans in their fight for freedom and equality in North Carolina. He used a new approach to civil rights issues in Durham, incorporating lower and middle class blacks, unlike the moderate accommodates approach to the black elite in Durham during his time. Austin's unusual strategy of advocating for the majority of blacks to have a voice in society succeeded in galvanizing a broader segment of the African American community in Durham to act for social change. Austin's approach to black activism helped lay the ground for modern civil rights movement in Durham in the late 1950s and the 1960s, which also encouraged lower income blacks to become politically active. His strategies were once considered too radical by his peers, allow Austin to maintain his influence in Durham well into the 1950s and 1960s. In doing so, Austin created a lasting impact for Durham. So right here you see what it says, quick facts. All right. So his early life. So he was born in Enfield, North Carolina, a small town 85 miles east of Durham. He grew up in a period when African Americans were denied basic civil liberties, including the right to vote. Throughout Austin's childhood, his father William taught him to stand up for his rights as a young adult. Austin was enraged about racial discrimination and spoke out about these types of injustice at his school. As a result, his parents sent him to finish his high school education at the Joe Brick School in Edgecombe County. Austin then attended the National Training School, now North Carolina Central University in Durham, North Carolina. After graduating college, Austin worked for the North Carolina Mutual Life Insurance Company, a black-owned company based in Durham. So as we go further down, we see that since freedom journals under history of the black press, the first black newspaper was founded in 1827. The black press served as an outlet for African Americans to define their own identity, create a sense of unity, present events from a black perspective, highlight black achievements that the mainstream press ignored, and most importantly, work for black equality. In the late 1800s and the early 1900s, Booker T. Washington, who was considered the preeminent spokesman for black America this time period, shared his accommodationist political ideologies in the black press throughout the country. He wielded great power among the black press by clandestinely controlling advertisement, loans, and political subsidies. Excuse me. Many newspapers at the time relied on Washington's financial support and therefore were obligated to write editorials that he favored. Madero defined the black press as an instrument of the Negro's upper classes for spreading conservative values and establishing group control and identity. All right. Now let's go down to here where it says significance in Durham. By the 1920s, Black America came to a fork in the road and had to choose whether to accommodate white societal viewpoints or oppose them. W.E.B. Du Bois opposed the white mainstream point of view. Durham was a microcosm of this national black debate, and black elites in Durham were champions of Washington accommodationist strategy. The newspaper published by the North Carolina Mutual Life Insurance Company, owned by Charles Clinton Spaulding, a leading member of the black elite in Durham, was quite open about the company's determination to resist W.E.B. Du Bois' calls for an aggressive challenge to white rule. So Louis Austin began All right, excuse me, I'm back. All right, so let's continue. So Louis Austin began working at the Carolina Times in 1921 when it was called the Standard Advisor. Upon joining the paper, he made it clear that he was committed to writing articles that were closely aligned with Du Bois' approach. Austin bought the Times in 1927 with the help of a loan from Durham's black-owned merchants and farmer bank. So during the early 20th century, black journalists like Austin played an essential role in the struggle for black equality in America. Austin worked as editor for the Times till his death in 1971. All right. So Austin's civil activism. The Carolina Times. Louis Austin worked tirelessly to shape the Carolina Times into a vehicle for change for African American community. He used the paper to re-energize the civil rights activism. African Americans who lived in Durham and the surrounding areas rely on their weekly subscription to inform them of issues that impacted the African American community. The paper's motto was "The truth unbridled," because Austin's mission was to provide North Carolinian African Americans the unadulterated truth about contemporary situation and events. Austin's honest and straightforward approach gave him credibility and strong support in Durham, North Carolina, and throughout the state. During a time when Jim Crow laws ruled the South and white supremacy was prevalent, Austin understood that it was necessary to directly confront the problems African Americans were facing and provide a voice for these problems. The Carolina Times was influential as it created an open dialogue amongst blacks in Durham, surrounding areas in North Carolina, and throughout the nation. All right. So his strategy was work towards achieving racial equality for blacks, regardless of their social economic status, by approaching discriminatory policies with a new confrontational strategy. Austin shared the political philosophy of Du Bois and Frederick Douglass, both of whom advocated protest as a political tool in struggle for equal rights. He realized that confrontation and defiance, not civility and accommodation, were needed to break white supremacy stronghold in the South. The civil rights movement in Durham during the early 1900s was controlled by wealthy blacks, primarily Spalding and James Shepard, president of North Carolina College for Negroes. Okay. These black elites were known as the Big Negroes. They were intended on maintaining peaceful race relation in Durham and did not want to promote campaigns that would upset powerful white people in Durham and throughout the country. Confrontational policies would agitate race relation in North Carolina and jeopardize the businesses and enterprise these Big Negroes controlled. Therefore, they saw no benefits pursuing policies in that inferred with a system in which they economically and somewhat socially comfortable. All right. So it says the direction towards which the black elites steered the civil rights movement was based on their own economic self-interest. These were not representative of the majority of the community in Durham, who were unemployed due to racial inequalities, not able to receive education. According to historian Freddie Parker, Durham was a diverse community that needed more than one black leader. Austin was extremely frustrated with the conservative leaders in Durham. Therefore, he strove to create a racially tolerant environment in Durham for all African Americans. Austin outspoken editorials in the Carolina Times diverged African Americans' inequalities and helped galvanize the African American community to focus on activism. All right. So, as you can see, let's give a recap. So, Louis Austin was a radicalist, and his primary focus was not to deal with the concept of bringing classism, division amongst blacks. So what you have witnessed here, according to the source, in Durham, North Carolina, there was division amongst black people from the black elites and the rest of the working class black folks. So what we see here is that the black elites want to control the narrative and be the one to become the face of African American community and shove everybody else to the side. Now, what does that sound like to you? What does that really sound like? I can tell you what that sounds like to me. That sounds like a form of white supremacy in a black face. That's what it sounds like. So these black elites were looking out for their own interests, and they want to be on good terms with white folks. They don't want to be on the negative side, because negative side means that there is going to be a problem. There's going to be something going to be jeopardized, and what's going to be jeopardized is the business. So that's what they were more so caring about. They weren't really caring too much about black people as a collective, as a whole. And Louis Austin took note. He peeped game and he said, let me step away from this. This is not where the direction is going to go. So this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to put the focus into black people in general, regardless what the social economics may be, regardless what political party they may represent. We're going to put that focus on black people in general, because we're all affected by this. No matter what you call yourself, conservative or liberal or whatever, you all are going to be affected. We all in this together. That was his attitude. That was the principle that he stood on. Now, as we can see here, okay, let's go down. Let's go down where it says, let's go down where it says, Lewis Austin believed that African Americans could achieve better rights while working within the confines of the political system. Austin viewed political participation as a means for blacks to voice their concern, and if the masses of the black community were politically engaged, they would be able to attain better rights. In 1928, there were only 50 black residents in Durham. Austin constantly embraced community mobilization in both local and national politics. Beginning in the late 1920s, Austin worked to directly confront restrictions such as literary tests that white supremacists imposed in order to keep blacks from voting. For example, in 1932, Austin led a statewide non-partisan political conference. All right. So non-partisan mean that there's no representation of neither political parties, no representation of Republicans, no representation of Democrats, no none of that. All right. Okay, so let's continue. It says, which attempted to foster black interest in voting and address the difficulties black face in getting to the polls. Austin recognized that the Republican Party was no longer the black man's party, and for African Americans, the key to gaining influence in North Carolina throughout the South was through the Democratic Party. Now, this is what he believed. In 1934, Austin displayed his newfound commitment to the Democratic Party when he and Frederick K. Watkins ran on the Democratic ticket and were elected justice of the peace in Durham. Throughout the country, the black press appalled their victory as a turning point for African American involvement in politics. For the first time in history of the South, two colored men elected to office on the Democratic ticket. Moreover, Austin's victory had important long significance. After Austin won, the local head of the Democratic Party tried to persuade him to back down. However, Austin remained adamant about serving in office. Austin thus established a precedent for blacks serving as justice peace in Durham. So while Austin did not obtain a powerful political position, according to Joseph Cannon, Austin's victory represented the success in African Americans. Was it flattering? Yeah, a flattering first step in politics in Durham. So another pivotal turn point in black political influence occurred in 1935 when Austin joined with Shepard and Spalding to form the Durham Committee on Negro Affairs, known as the DCNA. The DCNA dedicated itself to African Americans' economic, social, and educational opportunity and served as a means for African Americans in Durham to enter the political arena. The DCNA proved effective in registering blacks to vote. Black voters registration in Durham doubled in the year after the organization was founded. By 1939, there were 3,000 black voters in the city. All right, so, and then it goes on to talk about World War II era double V strategy. Okay, we're gonna read a little bit about the double V strategy. When the United States entered World War II, Austin seized the opportunity and implemented the double V campaign. Austin joined other black newspapers in articulating this dual strategy in which blacks fought for brief abroad against the Axis powers while fighting for victory at home against the forces of white supremacy. The campaign revealed the hypocrisy in America's supposed war for democracy abroad and attack on the Nazi discriminatory ideology by publicizing racial oppression at home. While Southern black editors such as P.B. Young of Norfolk Journal and Guide refused to directly attack segregation, Lewis Austin was the leading proponent of the Double V strategy in North Carolina and demanded the end of racial segregation. So one example Austin used to back the Double V campaign was how Americans condemned Japanese soldiers for committing atrocities against Americans, but they found nothing wrong with lynching African Americans. From the outset of World War II, Austin relentlessly attacked the government for all forms of discrimination and advocated for equal access for blacks in all branches of the armed forces. He expressed the absurdity of African Americans fighting for the right to put their lives at risk and defend their country. Then he goes on to say, moreover, Austin criticized conservative black leaders who did not condemn racial segregation in the armed forces. And then says at an October 1942 meeting amongst black leaders in Durham, to work on issuing a Durham manifesto, conservative leaders such as Spalding, Shepard, and Young expressed their disagreement with the principle and practice of compulsory segregation in our American society. However, they worried that if they endorsed outright rejection of racial segregation in the manifesto, it would create white backlash. And you know what that means, right? So let's skip over. Let's go down to where it says the race riot of 1943, which erupted in over 40 cities, including Durham, also factored into the growing segment amongst black activists to tone down their criticism. However, Austin remained determined to double V strategy and instead used the violent uprising to further his criticism by publicizing the harm that segregation was causing throughout the country. In the June of 1943, Austin expressed that the law of segregation was the root cause behind racial conflict in North Carolina. He believed that the riot in Durham represented the need for Durham to hire black police. While Austin utilized the race riots to demonstrate significant changes that were necessary in Durham and America, he publicly condemned the blacks who participated in the riots for their lawless behavior. All right. He urged blacks to pursue peaceful methods to end racial segregation. One method Austin advocated was telling every African American to write letters to their mayor, their governor, and their president and peacefully declare their frustration through the power of words. Throughout the war, Austin taught other African Americans the importance of pursuing non-violent methods when fighting segregation, such as publicly voicing their concern instead. Austin, by implementing Double V campaign, spurred a growing militant movement that would bear more fruit after the war. Okay. So now down here it talk about the opposition to black nationalist group, but I want to give my thoughts and my views on this. But before I go there, let me take a little break real quick. All right, so violence was going to take place regardless whether people fought back or whether it was non-violence. So our ancestors thought that non-violence was the way to be able to combat against the system without being rebellious. it didn't really protect a lot of people at the same time. People were still getting hurt. People's life was still put in harm's way. And then while there were nonviolent protests, there were those who decided they won't take it upon themselves to fight. They were not going to allow themselves to be constantly bullied or beaten down by law enforcement or racist people. All right. So that was the whole thing. So yeah, people took it upon themselves to fight back. They said, "Nah, we're not going for this. We're not going to tolerate it. We're not going to accept this at all." All right. So it says opposition to black nationalist group. While Austin rallied the masses to join with the new generation of activists in order to effect change, he denounced the black nationalist and separatist organization that arose in the 1950s and early 1960s, and thought unlawful tactics were a necessary means to achieve their goals. Austin proclaimed that the Carolina Times would not give its support to any person or group or persons advocating a resort to violence as a means of solving the black man's problem in this country or elsewhere. Instead, Austin believed that African Americans should work within the confines of the legal system to effect change. He already had he had already seen society change tremendously throughout his lifetime. Austin believed that the pen is mightier than the sword, and throughout his life, whenever he felt angry about racial injustice, he voiced them in Carolina Times instead of resort to violence. Austin displayed these segments in an editorial in Times. We call upon every Negro of sound judgment in this country to throw his support to that segment of the National Association of Advancement of Colored People and other civil rights organizations that believe in and intend to practice law and order. Austin supported young, new movements whose philosophy were based on nonviolence, such as the Southern Christian Leadership Conference led by Martin Luther King Jr. Austin was a forerunner to these big movements as they echo extremely similar beliefs to those that he had been stressing since the early 1920s. All right. So if you guys want to read any more, y'all can go ahead and read more information about it. So going down here, it says impact. Austin continued to advocate for civil rights causes until he died on June the 12th of 1971. During his lifetime, he lived to see his life work of devoted civil rights activism come full circle. He lobbied against white supremacy, the Jim Crow laws, racism, lynching, police brutality, employment discrimination, housing discrimination, segregation in schools, as well as other forms of racial discrimination. So Durham historian Gene Anderson described Austin as in the indefatigable crusader for justice and civil rights of a new class of blacks who could toll to no one, and he made the paper an unrelenting crusader for all blacks causes, including in his coverage news that bore on race relations all over the nation. All right. All right. So yep, it says Austin used the Carolina Times to broadcast racial discrimination in order for them to be heard. After Austin died, a letter to the editor in a newspaper based in Virginia stated that Austin left to Durham a rich heritage of unselfish service and a better community than it would have been otherwise. It is evident that Austin's impact was known throughout the South and the United States, and not only in North Carolina. All right. So you guys want to read more into this, you can do so. Okay, so as you can see, it talk about the post-hominid recognition, and he was recognized as a main honoree by the Sequential Honors Commission at the Durham 150 closing ceremony in Durham, North Carolina on November 2nd, 2019. Post-hominid recognition was bestowed upon 29 individuals whose dedication, accomplishment, and passion have helped shape Durham in important ways. All right, so again, you guys can look this up. All right, look it up. You'll see the reference at the bottom of the page. Okay, and that is the Wikipedia source. All right, now I have an article. Let's see. I also have an article here that you guys can check out. This is called Meet the Faces of Durham, Lewis Austin. Okay, so you can find it at Museum of Durham History. Just go on Museum of Durham History.org right there. And right here is where you find information. All right. Then I have an article here from jaster.org, written by Jerry Gershenhorn. I think that's how you say his name, Gershenhorn. So yeah, Jerry Gershenhorn wrote a piece in this article called "A Courageous Voice for Black Freedom: Lewis Austin and the Carolina Times in Depression Era, North Carolina." So let me go ahead and post it up for y'all. So right here, you can look it up, the North Carolina Historical Review, volume 87. Okay, number 1, January 2010, page 57 to 92, 36 pages. Okay, it was published by North Carolina Office of Archives and History. So you guys can look this right here. All right. So it's a lot of stuff y'all can look into. Y'all can read this. Okay, I'm not gonna really go into it, but just want to show y'all some more sources that y'all can check out. Again, and let me blow up this book. Okay, so the name of this book right here is the North Carolina Historical Review. All right. So that's it. And here's the book. Now, this is the picture of Lewis Austin. Okay, that's him right there. The title of this book called Lewis Austin and the Carolina Times: A Life in the Long Black Freedom Struggle by Jerry Gershenhorn. Yeah, by Jerry Gershenhorn. All right, so as you can see, there's the introduction. Chapter 1, No Man is Your Captain, the Making of an Agitator. All right, we got to fight for our rights, advocacy, journalism in the Great Depression. Double B in North Carolina, the struggle for racial equality during the World War II. And chapter 4, segregation must and will be destroyed, the Black freedom struggle. Chapter 5, we want equality now, challenging segregation after Brown. And chapter 6, the gospel of the sit-in, direct action. And chapter 7, it was a wonder I wasn't lynched, a freedom fighter to the end. Okay. All right, so here's the introduction. So the introduction quotes, "Our eternal goal must be equality. We will teach and thunder it from the pulpit until every child achieves it." Lewis Austin. So let's go to the intro. It says in 1933, a young North Carolinian man named Thomas Raymond Hokut dreamed of becoming a pharmacist. As he completed his undergraduate studies at Durham's North Carolina College for Negroes, he was forced to reckon with the fact that only white University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill housed a pharmacy program. At the very same time, three young civil rights activists, two attorneys, and a journalist were searching for a brave African American who would agree to challenge Jim Crow higher education. The attorneys were Corrad Pearson and Cecile McCoy, who practiced law in Durham. The journalist was 35-year-old Lewis Austin, editor of the Carolina Times, the black news weekly in Durham. After Hokut agreed to apply to UNC, the four men drove from Durham to Chapel Hill to register the young man for the March quarter of classes. Austin introduced Hokut to University Registrar and of Admission Thomas Wilson. This is Mr. Hokut, a new student who need his class schedule and class assignment. After the startled registrar recovered his composure, he denied Hokut admission because of his race, and Pearson and McCoy filed suit in the state court. In the short term, the case did not succeed, but these young men's action launched the NAACP legal struggle that would culminate with the U.S. Supreme Court's landmark versus Board of Education decision in 1954, declared that segregated public education was unconstitutional. All right, so Lewis Austin part in the Hokut case was characteristic on his decades-long role as a leader in the long black freedom struggle in North Carolina. Although he grew up in an era of bleak possibilities and grave dangers for blacks in the state, he courageously challenged racial injustice throughout his life. So in 1898, the year of his birth, white supremacists murdered African Americans and violently overthrew the biracial government of Wilmington, North Carolina. 2 years later, white Democrats amended the state's constitution to disfranchise black voters. Nonetheless, by the time he drew his last breath 7 decades later in 1971, Lewis Austin had helped transform the racial landscape of the state, the region, and the nation. All right. So it says, during the 20th century, black journalists played an essential role in the struggle for equal rights in America. While the most prominent black newspaper, the Chicago Defender and the Pittsburgh Courier, were published in the North, several Southern black newspapers also played a pivotal role in the fight against white supremacy. Operating in the nation's most racially oppressive section, the determined black publishers, editors, and journalists eliminated racial discrimination while advocating black voter registration and equal educational opportunity. A few black Southern journalists pursued a more radical agenda and directly challenged racial segregation. Austin, who edited and published the Carolina Times from 1927 to 1971, was one of the most fearless and effective of these journalists. He boldly challenged white supremacy and racial segregation for over 4 decades, from the years prior to World War II through the modern civil rights era. Not all black Southern journalists consistently oppose racial oppression or even advocate for racial integration. Percy Green, editor of Mississippi Jackson, advocated fought for black voting rights during the 1940s, but during the late 1950s and 1960s, he collaborated with the segregationist Mississippi State Sovereignty Commission, denouncing the Brown versus Board of Education decision and the Montgomery bus boycott. Cornelius A. Scott, editor of the Atlanta Daily World, promoted voter registration campaigns during the 1940s, but opposed direct action protests, including sit-in, during the 1960s. In North Carolina, the Charlotte Post, headed by publisher and editor J.S. Nathaniel Tross, a minister of the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, opposed the integration of public schools, supported North Carolina Governor Luther Hodges' effort to delay integration, and criticized Martin Luther King Jr. Tross claimed that sit-in merely exacerbated racial conflict without benefit to the black community. All right. So in contrast, Austin was part of a cadre of black journalists in the South who played leading roles in fighting for racial equality, refusing to moderate or reverse their stance in the face of white harassment or pressure. These crusading black journalists routinely fought for the rights of African Americans by employing a powerful and compelling form of advocacy journalism. The groundwork laid by these journalists helped accelerate the movement for equal rights in the 1950s and 1960s. So in South Carolina, John McCrae, publisher of the Charleston Lighthouse, and E.A. Parker, publisher of the Sumter People's Informer, merged their newspaper in 1941 to create Lighthouse and Informer as an organ in the fight for equal salaries for black teachers in South Carolina. So 3 years later, McCrae and journalist Osceola McCain formed the Progressive Democratic Party to increase black political influence in South Carolina. In Arkansas, LC and Daisy Bates were staunch activists using the state press to aid in black freedom struggle. They championed the Brown versus Board of Education decision, and Daisy Bates nobly advised the 9 black students who desegregated Central High School in Little Rock in 1957. In Oklahoma, Roscoe Dungy, editor of the Oklahoma City Black Dispatch, advocated legal action to desegregate higher education and housing, ensure voting rights for black people, and equalize teacher salary. All right, so that's the introduction of this book, which is called The Lewis Austin and the Carolina Times, Life in the Long Black Freedom Struggle, okay, by Jerry Gershonhorn. So by Jerry Gershonhorn, that's the name of the author. So you guys can look this book up. And if you guys want to purchase the book, you can purchase the book. It is available. So that was the only book I was able to find. All right. So with that being said, that's all the information that I have available for today, for this wonderful evening. Okay. And I hope you guys have a good one. I hope you all be safe. All right. Be productive. Take care of yourself. Don't get caught up in no nonsense. All right. And shout out to all the polymaths and the filiomath. So I'm gonna maybe later on I'm gonna build on what a filiomath is. Okay, but filiomath is someone who loves to learn and who loves to study. So I'm gonna build on that later on. Okay, all right. So shout out to everybody that's doing the work and that's actually teaching on other platforms and educating the people and whatnot. And thank you guys who have been very supportive over here. All right, take it easy on yourselves. Make sure you subscribe to the channel, like the channel, share the channel, etc., etc. And I will talk to you guys later. So peace and power, elevation be to all you. This girl Tiffany. I'm logging off saying deuces. All right, thanks.